Middle East Union concept would share little with the region's current confederations, the League of Arab States, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the proposed Gulf Union. The MEU wouldn't seek to limit Arab Spring contagion, but to fulfill its promise of a better life for the region's peoples. It wouldn't seek to stifle the political and economic aspirations of women and minorities, but to give them a voice through democratic institutions and targeted economic programs. It wouldn't seek to preserve archaic monarchies, sheikdoms, and dictatorships, but to transform them into functioning democracies. It wouldn't seek to oppose Israel's existence, but to fully engage that state in a multi-nation effort to obtain regional advancement. It wouldn't seek broad economic cooperation that fails to benefit average Middle East citizens, but could initiate specific programs to raise living standards for every segment of the region's population. It wouldn't seek to extend the region's cruel record on human and civil rights, but could work to imbue citizens with the respect demanded by moral propriety. It wouldn't seek to favor or disparage any religion, but to protect religious practice for all individuals of faith. And it wouldn't seek to compromise national sovereignty, but to engender a shared commitment to mutual freedoms and development. The MEU's administrative structure could be designed to support 8 distinct objectives. 1, an agency for democratic transition could facilitate democratization, for example, assisting with the development of new constitutions. 2, an economic development agency could work to diversify and grow national economies. 3, a union education institute could provide MENA youth who have doubled in numbers between 1980 and 2010 with education and training to significantly increase labor force participation, currently the lowest regional rate in the world, and reduce unemployment, the highest regional rate. 4, an MEU Rights Council could provide each nation with means to guarantee basic human and civil rights. For example, by sponsoring studies to determine the level of rights provided and thereby forming the basis for remedial action. 5, an Office of Economic Opportunity could work to reduce poverty and income inequality, raising the standard of living of the region's population below the poverty line. 6, an MEU legislature could provide an organized venue for intra-union negotiations and deliberations. 7, an MEU Office of Management and Budget could assess annual dues, seek international funding from individual nations and economic organizations, solicit private capital to fund commercial projects, and conduct a continuous program of audits to ensure that resources are allocated appropriately while modern, efficient, and corruption-free procedures are followed. And 8, an MEU Security Center staffed by United Nations forces could maintain the integrity of member borders and enforce agreements reached. 3 agreements could facilitate MEU launch by changing the context in which the region's nations exist with one another. 1, signature on a membership non-aggression pact could be a prerequisite to joining the MEU. Freed from the fear of regional conflict, MEU members could be empowered to focus on positive outcomes rather than continue the non-productive work of acquiring the instruments of war and securing military objectives. 2, an international force including archaeological experts could provide protection and open access to all religious sites within Israel and a new Palestinian state, as well as in all other MEU nations. And 3, an independent Palestinian state, another MEU prerequisite, could be formed to provide a homeland for Palestinian refugees and other Palestinians seeking to live in their own nation. A freeze in Israeli settlements could be matched by peace along its borders. Negotiations could join the Gaza and West Bank by a secure corridor, forming a demilitarized Palestinian state with borders protected by the UN force. East Jerusalem could serve as the Palestinian state's religious capital, while the city's Jewish quarter could become Israel's religious capital. Compensation could be provided to refugees and their descendants in the form of cash payments, construction of new homes, and education and training. Israel and those nations that voted to support formation of the Jewish state could fund these costs. This agreement could eliminate refugee camps, undermine the hatred of Israel Jews in the West, and provide a huge economic stimulus to the new Palestinian state.
5 minutes.
Successful implementation of MEU initiatives by neighboring states would cast a shadow of opportunity on those in authority who fail to provide comparable rights and economic advancement. Such resistance would invite the organization of domestic movements to change course. At the same time, terrorist motivations would be muted by the elimination of refugee camps, spreading non-sectarian education, improved economic life, greatly expanded human and civil rights, and the freedoms of democratic institutions. For many of the region's nations, the MEU could offer restoration of dignity through enhanced rights, democratic institutions, and economic gains that will take advantage of recent revolutions to earn the respect of the family of nations worldwide. For Israel, the MEU could offer peace among its neighbors and an opportunity to establish trade and working relationships with regional powers. Unless the parties learn to work together, the union's potential would not be realized. The fate of Middle East nations rests on their ability to bring the region's governments out from the ancient mindsets and their harvest of pain and into modern times and the dignity that progress would engender. How might a Middle East union be established? Construction could proceed in 4 distinct steps. 1, a proposal could be circulated among potential members and their populations and interested parties around the world. 2, if adequate support for the MEU concept became evident, academic and political experts could convene a working session to put more meat on the bones of the proposal. 3, at the conclusion of the above work, an international MEU conference could be organized. All Middle East nations could be invited to participate in work group sessions whose aim would be to refine and amend the product of the expert session. And 4, the final product of the above sessions could be consolidated into a formal treaty and transmitted to each Middle East nation. There are those who will view the MEU proposal as a pipe dream. They will place the ideas advanced against the backdrop of thousands of years of conflict and authoritarian rule. They will conclude that Middle East nations will never be free to put the old grudges and oppressive ways aside and focus on bettering their own people through mutual action and cooperation. On the other hand, students of history may look to the success of the European Union and recall how its earliest rendering helped to move member states away from extreme nationalism and towards democracy and economic recovery, eventually emerging from the rubble of World War II. Certainly, Arab youth sacrificing their lives to finally turn the page is a powerful symbol that times are changing. The key question is whether the region's freedom fighters will be left on their own. With little experience in democratization and the means to form an equitable economic system, it is evident that expert assistance and funding could play a useful, if not decisive, role in promoting a smooth transition to democracy and economic prosperity. Might a Middle East Union be formed to assume that responsibility?
I'd like to ask our second presenter to offer his views. Topic is September 11th, a decade later, toward a nonviolent, pluralistic Middle East. Dr. Etzioni.
I'm going to claim 84 years to sit down my life. I want to focus to the collapse. Happy Dr. Boswell first, a very inspiring talk. And I must admit that initially I thought some was on the idealistic side, but then I remembered that President Sarkozy was on your side, because he was the first to suggest a Middle Eastern Union. He's a fairly realistic and important fellow, and he suggested when he was the president of France, it was not just a speech, and actually one of the ideas was that Turkey, who was kind of rejected by Europeans, instead of feeling rejected and alienated, could become a major player in your union. So, more power to you. So what I'm going to talk about is not nearly as inspiring, but also I think on the positive side. I came to this thought when I was invited in 2002 by the reformers in Iran to come and participate in a dialogue in a place called the Dialogue of Civilizations in Isfahan. And I deliberately asked after the meeting to be able to travel to the rest of Iran rather than just get out of Iran, which is gives you a somewhat distorted picture. And the Dialogue of Civilization, I had to prepare a paper, and I started with Sam Huntington's notion that we have a clash of civilization. And while I won't be completely fair to him, I think I'm fairly accurate in summarizing what he argued was that there were 6 or 7 civilizations, depends how you classify them, but there was one which had the light, the wisdom and rationality, and everybody else was impassioned, irrational, floundering, mistaken, heretic. And the one which had the light was, of course, the Western civilization. In effect, and this is almost a direct quote, when he was asked about the relationship between Islam and terrorism, Huntington said, quote, "I have 400 years of history to prove that they're all terrorists." Now, I didn't think that's quite a way to go. So I did the following study, and there are 2 parts to it. One, I collected with a large number of young people helping me, quite cool, texts of all the major religions and of secular ideology, specific socialism. And what we found in all of them, including Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and socialism, in all of them, texts which on the one hand legitimate and promote violence, on the other hand texts which reject and delegitimate violence in all of them. And out of that came our number 1 finding, that there is a clash of civilization within our civilization. Between, on the one side, those who embrace and celebrate violence and those who condemn it. And so, for instance, you have among the Crusaders a notion of what's called a positive violence theory, which legitimated the Crusaders crisis is depicted as a sword. On the other hand, you have him depicted as the Prince of Peace. You have in Judaism the line, the tooth for a tooth, and an eye for an eye. It's full of vengeance. But then the rabbis came and said, you misunderstand, you mean you have to compensate. Then, so it's not a notion of revenge or a notion of reconciliation. In Islam, we have the notion that jihad, by some, is a spiritual journey of self-improvement, by others is killing the last for them. So in all of them, you have this division. It's very prominent in socialism. You have on the one hand Stalinism, and on the other hand the Fabians of one kill a mosquito. So you see that, first of all, this division, there is a division, but it runs first of all to the ideologies, the belief systems of all major civilizations, secular and religious. And then we took the next step and said, well, fine, these are books or speeches or prophecies, but what about people out there? And we collected all of the public opinion polls ever done in the Muslim world. And you find something interesting. Only a minority of Muslims, especially in the larger countries like Indonesia and Bangladesh and such, but in all of them, including on the West Bank, on a minority legitimate violence, and a majority renounce. So it's not only there's a division, but the camps are very far from equal. It's a different story, and that is very important for what I like to share with you today, when you ask them about democracy and human rights. It's not the same to reject violence or to favor peaceful solutions, to favor political systems, and to embrace a particular form of democracy and our particular way, our American way of doing it. Actually, I think many Americans forget the very notion of separation of state and church is really a French-American idea. Most Western democracy have established religions. And for those who think, oh, well, the British have established religion, but nobody shows up, well, then you go to Scandinavia, and you see, you have to be a Lutheran. To be a king, you have to be a Lutheran to get paid from the government. And while they now say they're not going to pay for churches anymore, well, they pay historical maintenance fees for the cathedrals, which are not available to any other religion. I can't resist for an anecdote. The other day, they happened to be in a session with the Prime Minister of Norway, and he said, well, we are done in teaching Christian values in our public schools. We are now have a school which teaches all kinds of values, including Islam. And I said, well, that's wonderful. I'd like to go and visit those schools. And he said, well, there's one in South Oslo. So what started as a claim for reform of the whole system is really, and in fact, most European schools still teach Christian values. So the point is that there are very different models of political system, and if you make the basis of our international order that you had to subscribe to the American Bill of Rights in its enumeration, you will find a majority of the people in the world supporting it. If you make your basis rejection of violence and an acceptance of a variety of pluralism of political systems, you'll find a majority of people in the world, including the majority of Muslims, supporting it. They are reliable partners in peace. They are not necessarily partners in our kind of democracy. So that's when you now come to the question, how should we distinguish between different Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi, or different parties and movements in the Middle East? And if your criteria is, if you go what we did, that we had rebellion in Libya, the first thing we ask, are these people democratic? Are they supporting democracy? That was the wrong question. I think the question should have been, are they going to support peaceful resolutions? It turns out that they learned to say some words about democracy, but, and I'm not sure you all know that the rebels in Libya committed the same kind of number of killings and raping and ethnic cleansing as the Gaddafi regime. They turned whole towns into ghost towns because they had black Libyans. They had their own racist notion. Once the came to the parts of Tripoli in those areas, they just devastated. After Gaddafi was basically lynched. And so my moral and pragmatic criteria is the same. The most basic human rights is the right to be alive. And that is so elementary that we just usually don't bother to say. And the reason I said so elementary, but that people, their right to free speech, to assemble, it doesn't mean terribly much to them. If you live, you may have a chance to fight another day. I'm not belittling your right to assemble, to speak and such, but they're contingent and the notion that you be alive. So therefore I think the first foundation in the Middle East should be, are you going to solve things with violence or counter-violence, or are you willing to try to solve things politically? That will distinguish between various Muslim parties. So that's the project I carried out. Those of you who want to see the small print, it takes about 60 pages, can look at a book called Security First. So what I did since then, and I very much need help, and I mean it not out of false humility, but because you see at the moment I have hard evidence that I need help. And that is, I want to take one more step. And I want to see what Islam says about social justice. And let me explain why I went in that direction. It started actually almost by a small incident. I went to a talk by the head of the Muslim Brotherhood party in Tunisia, and he said, "Oh, I'm all in favor of human rights. I'm all for employment." And it kind of first kind of hurt my remembrance. That's not what you expect. When people talk about human rights, you talk about full employment. But then it hit me. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, does not discriminate between political and civil and legal rights and socio-economic rights. So this notion which America is almost automatic. And when you talk about rights, you talk about political rights. But social justice, that's a liberal left thought, is not, has the same basic foundation. That's again a very American notion. But as far as the Universal Declaration is concerned, which is what we base on ourselves, when we talk transnationally, it does not draw such a line. And by the way, neither does the German Constitution. In fact, many non-American constitutions, democratic constitutions, have a respectable room for social rights. So then you find now parties in the Middle East, in Turkey, in Tunisia, Morocco, which are called development and justice. Now listen to this for a moment. What happened to freedom? And in Egypt, you have party, but the emphasis is on the economic social side. So that's as far basically as we got, aside from figure running out of time. But where I got stuck is, so I wanted to see to what degree these are again texts, and I have plenty of, because when you send me an email, I send you texts. The Quran is full of references to social justice or other Muslim texts. But more than that, the Muslim Brotherhood, for various reasons, for selfish and political and ideological reasons, really engage in specific programs of social justice. It's not just our party get you to vote and then they go home. The Muslim Brotherhood, including by the Hezbollah and Hamas, provide a fairly rich set of services. Again, in part because that's what they could do when they were oppressed, in part because it gives them membership, in part because they believe it. So what I try then to do is find in the history of each of the specific parties, like in Turkey, like in Tunisia, what role did social justice play in the development of the platform, in the ideology, and in the current program? It gets murky because to some degree they influence the economists. I wish you would be there, but there are other kind of economists who believe that free market infuse you all. They never really read Adam Smith because Adam Smith has two books, not just the rest of the nation is kind of called the theory of moral sentiments. But they didn't get to number two. And so all their concern is a really free market cure. Even if you agree to that, and God have mercy on the soul of you today, it surely doesn't apply to a registered society. A society cannot be based on the notion of a free market. So, but I didn't get very far. It turns out that I need help. So any and all of you here with you have a standing invitation. Any of you know more about social justice in the Muslim world? Call me in the middle of the night, send me an email.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome our third presenter, Dr. Bessma Momani, speaking on non-inclusive economic growth and the built environment in the Arab Middle East, precursor to the Arab Spring.
This is a paper stemming from some research that I did in a lot of countries, so bear with me, it's a bit experimental. Like many people, I'm interested in, what's the purpose and what's the cause of the Arab Spring, and I'm not going to say I have a definitive answer, but there's something that was happening in the Middle East, both as a political economist. I was monitoring and seeing before my eyes, and with intimate knowledge of the region, something didn't add up. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that, despite perhaps what many may think of the region, this was a region for the past decade has been growing macroeconomically. So, what's quite interesting is that you have countries like Egypt, 5%, 6% GDP growth. This is in 2009, 2010, so post-financial crisis. Similarly, Syria was about 7% GDP growth throughout the entire region. Tunisia, and these were all the successful, quote-unquote, economic liberalizers. And that's really kind of a puzzle. It goes against the convention of thinking that this is, why would you see sort of protests at a time when so much of the economic situation is improving? Now, add to that we all know there is a huge element of economic grievances and a part of explaining the Arab Spring. We know in the West that we'd like to use the word it's about democracy. It's really rarely about democracy. There was a lot of, I think, real calls for bread and justice, redistribution, great feeling of inequality, gap between the rich and poor, huge high perceptions of corruption of the governing elite. All of that is there. So how does this all mesh together? And one of the things that interests me is this idea of having growth, but that's non-inclusive. In other words, that's what we really saw in the Arab world. What we saw was, yes, we had growth. Again, macroeconomic is high, but at the same time, this was not literally being redistributed to the people. So every average person didn't feel it in their pocket. This is part of the grievances that explain the Arab Spring. So I take that premise as really a fundamental explanation. Now I want to kind of deconstruct that and see how that really manifested itself. And one of the things that I've noticed is, particularly because I do a lot of work on macroeconomic growth of the region, is what we saw for 2003, 2008 with the second oil boom, when prices were over $100 a barrel. This was a time when many of the Arab Gulf countries had huge capital surpluses. I mean, they were really touted as being, that with China and at the time, India, Brazil. They were the countries that had this massive amount, something in the order of $1 to $2 trillion of excess wealth, or call it capital surplus, that could not actually go into those countries to be reinvested because of malabsorption issues, and that's a whole other sort of economic phenomena. But where did that money go? Well, it didn't go to the West traditionally, where it has often gone into the U.S. Treasury. Part of that is Dubai Ports deal. There's a whole other issue that I have a whole book on, sort of Gulf investment. But where it went, very interestingly, was next door. It went into the Arab Middle East countries. Okay, and so what we saw was an influx of billions of dollars into the Arab Middle East. Countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, you name it, every single one of them, particularly the ones that were growing. Why were they growing? Well, and this is the thing that comes down to what interested me, is how these countries were growing. And when we look at the urban landscape, which again, any visitor of the Middle East would know, these are countries that within the past decade now have these enormous towers, now have, what started off with one mall, now 40 malls. Resort towns. In my trips to Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria, and even Jordan. I mean, the amount of sort of these glamorous, shiny, new real estate developments, okay, were just propping up everywhere, okay? Where was the impetus for that? Well, again, it's Arab Gulf money. So the Arab Gulf money, again, billions of sort of $2 trillion of capital surplus, went into the Arab Middle East, and what did they invest in? The one, frankly, sector they know well, real estate, okay? So we had a Dubaization of so many of these different cities throughout the Arab world. And that, I think, it's indisputable. I mean, there's lots of evidence suggesting that. We know that often the root ownership of many of these grandiose kind of real estate developments were either Arab Gulf capital directly, or they were based on sort of remittances from investors, let's say Iranian investor who actually made his or her wealth in the Arab Gulf, okay? But the tie, if you will, the money linkage is very quite clear, for the research that I did on the ground, plenty of evidence that says this is where the source of this money is. Okay, so given that, one of the things that really interested me was in relating this to the Arab Spring was, what did this built environment, okay, this is the concept of real estate, towers and malls, what did that do? And does it have any role in explaining the Arab Spring? And this is something that really interested me because part of this was at a time when I was a fellow at an urban development think tank in Amman. And we had did a national survey, we had done focus groups, we had interviewed tons of state officials, both city level, mayors, municipal leaders, etc. And one of the things that was very, very interesting is one, they took this idea that buildings and malls and towers were sources of development, that they were modernization. So this is really interesting. Part of explaining the pull factor too is that they also swallowed this pill that's really believes that this is signs of success. Okay, and it's really important to note that because I think I don't want to fault the Arab Gulf investors. They go where money is accepted. What is incumbent is on those leaders in the Arab countries that continue to believe that this was some sort of form of quote-unquote development. And they sold it that way. I mean, so you had Suzanne Mubarak, other people in Ben Ali, as well, his wife, all these sort of ceremonial openings of the next mall, the next, resort, and the next tower. The elite at the time were very much, I think, using that kind of development model and propagating it as some sort of success. And this is problematic on one front. But what's interesting from the research that I did in terms of people on the ground is how did they feel, right? And what I found really interesting is while the elite are touting this, as this great symbol of modernization, there are a lot of people in the country who were very depressed by these structures. And that's what I think has really motivated me to really look into sort of how people feel about the built environment. And one of the things that I found interesting in the research, talking to people, and again in the focus groups that we did a huge cross-section. We did women's groups, we did poor, we did elite, we did children, we did teenagers, we did business professionals. And so many of those who were not participating, i.e. could not afford to be in those buildings, could not afford to be a part of those tourist resorts, and those villages that are created, the resort villages that are created along the coast, for example, in Egypt and so forth, and these malls found these structures to be utterly depressing. Okay, and in my reading of this is that this led to this sort of frustration, this social frustration among the people of the Arab Middle East, who start to look at these structures where you have you would have a leader who would again tout this as being this great marvel of success, and you as an individual feel very alienated from this structure. You feel very much as though this further disenfranchises you. Okay, so the example that I say is you go to the mall throughout the Middle East, and now there's a competition of who has the biggest mall. I mean, the mall that was fashionable in January is so out of style by September. And you could see that it's quite remarkable. But if you go into these malls where many of young people are walking around, often it's the only public space that they can go to because they don't have to pay anything to go into it. And these are countries that are ultimately still very much developing and poor. So think of yourself, you're a graduate of university, you're the first of your class, but you go into these malls and you can't buy anything, right? it's, again, that's the kind of frustration one feels. So these so-called spaces of modernization are further alienating people from feeling empowered about their very position in society. And it doesn't help that, there are constant reminders of inequity with these structures, right? Constant reminders of your inability to further ahead, because, as every tower goes up and as every mall comes over, you as an individual who hasn't been succeeding in society because of all the structural barriers against you are ever reminded that you have not attained that source of wealth, okay? Now, big problem too is that all of these deals were very much full of corruption, whether it was how they acquired the land, how they acquired the quick permits, a lot of circumventing of the rules, both on the books and off the books, to really get all this Gulf investment in. So again, my point is that this rapid urban development throughout the entire region was a part of explaining this added frustration against the rulers and against many of the sort of economic policies that were being purported at the time. And I think it is partially helping explain why we see such frustration resulting from the Arab Spring. That's it.
Thank you. We'd like to devote some time to questions. I'll just ask the presenters to limit their responses to 3 to 5 minutes, if that's possible. Anyone for any of the presenters?
Recommendation for the last speaker. Looking at the frustration, aggression theory by Dollar, 1947.
By sorry?
Just name frustration, aggression theory, but basically relative deprivation theory.
Yes.
Developed by Taylor. What started with Stanford, that would be very applicable for the study.
I've used Taylor, yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. But the other one I won't think.
Okay, great.
Anybody else? Questions for any of the speakers? Sir.
My question is directed to the last speaker. I just wonder if this non-inclusive economic growth explanation applies to Syria, do we have such a case in Syria or just in UAE or some other kind of more modernized?
Oh, it's very much Syria. Very much Syria. In fact, if you look at how the Syrian uprising started, it was rural areas.
Absolutely.
It was areas like Daraa, it was areas like Hama and Homs. And they were very much seeing Damascus is the last to fall for a reason, partly because the Damascus elite have been doing really well in the past 10 years. And the Gulf investment was enormous in Syria. There isn't a country, Syria is perhaps one of, not really the highest like Jordan and Egypt and Lebanon, but, for all those who, particularly Syrians, who want to say that somehow the Gulf are going to gain from this advantage, they've lost a lot of money as a result of the uprising in Syria. So there's an enormous amount of financial investment in the real estate sector in Syria, absolutely.
Yeah, my comment is also towards Bessma. So I think there's another part of the story, which is the action of getting to the mall on the part of the youngsters.
For sure, transportation.
It's so expensive. So take the case of Amman, where many of these disenfranchised youngsters, youth would be coming from East Amman to West Amman, where the malls are. And the act of getting from one side of town to the other is going to be a large investment of time, but also of money. And so by the time they actually get to the mall, they've spent whatever savings they might have acquired from their part-time, job in the Ahwa somewhere, in Tarbur or something. And so it's this interesting moment of ambivalence. Because on the one hand, they're investing so much to get to a place, where on the other hand, they're totally disenfranchised from participating in fully. And that deep ambivalence is absolutely, I think, to include this as part of the Arab Spring story becomes really important. The promises of consumption being so high and so lofty, and at the same time so deeply disenchantizing, if you will, for the youth. And I think that action somehow getting there really epitomizes that deep ambivalence.
Well, and transportation, one of the things that I discovered in my research was how transportation was very much one of the key sources of frustration for so many people. If you were in Egypt that was the bane of your existence, was to get from A to B. And similarly, if you don't have a car in Jordan, you're immobilized. Public transportation does not work for you. It's not done properly. So, absolutely, yeah, that's great.
My question is for Mr. Etzioni, or rather I should say Professor Etzioni.
Mr. is fine.
I'm a freshman at the George Washington University, so my question is about the U.S.'s role in the future of the Middle East. I know recently you've stated in blog posts that I've read and different articles that it's more about engaging those countries rather than confronting them. What do you think we'll see in the next 4 years with the new administration coming in terms of the State Department that is different from the past 4 years? Do you think that there's going to be a change in anything that's substantial on an ideological level or anything concrete that you
Well, these are all vague, fine questions, and I must say, to be serious, the first thing I have to warn that you cannot make predictions. They are all terribly tentative for all kind of reasons. We want to plan, we need to plan, we're interested, if you're committed. But it turns out that really we often can't. I don't know many people who predicted 9/11, and I don't know many people who predicted the Arab Spring or awakening or the financial crisis and such. And even people who said sooner or later this autocratic regime is going to collapse. But this is, the economists have that joke, give them a date or give them a figure, but never both. Because if you, that's a safe prediction, I would say it's going to happen at some point. So having this in mind, based on what we know now, if it unfolds as predicted, as it currently indicates, first of all, there is an enormous reluctance to engage in another war in the Middle East, enormous reluctance, if we do, to use large conventional forces. It looks like the lesson of Iran and Afghanistan is beginning to sink in, and when these places will fall much more apart over the next year, which I will predict, the lesson that the $1.5 trillion we invested there and all the blood not just ours, at least 100,000 Iraqis have been killed. I'm just talking killed, not wounded. In addition to 250,000 wounded since we liberated. Yeah. So I think we developed considerable inhibitions for forceful interventions, including in Syria. And that is reflected in the public opinion, aside from the President's personal preference and taste. Now, so if we're not going to intervene militarily, walk around Iran for a moment, because it may force our hand, but any other place, economic intervention are also minimized. Because, go back to my earlier point, our attempts at nation building have been extremely unproductive. One of the myths made about Iraq is that we didn't have a plan for after the war. That's true about the military. But the State Department had a 13-volume plan, and they're going to fix everything, from the welfare to justice to schools to textbooks to the stock exchange. It's a wonderful book. I mean, it's a great, great read when you're tired. By the Washington Post correspondent who covered Iraq, called Life in the Emerald City. And it has a page after page after page about how incompetent, ideologically mistaken, misbegotten, wasteful, corrupt our intervention was. And the result are a lot of unfinished or blown up buildings, especially all over Afghanistan. And so I think, in short, anybody talks about a Marshall Plan for the Middle East, they may have noble intentions, but it's not going to happen. So we're not going to intervene on a large scale. Militarily, we are limited economically. We have, quote, to engage in nation building at home, put our own house in order. So, trade is somewhat better. In general, if you look what happened we did much better when we engaged in trade rather than in aid. So that we may have a little more of that. And so then we come down to ideological, spiritual things. And there, as I read in my paper, I think we're completely misdirected. We try to see this through our lenses without any sensitivity understanding of the I can take one more minute?
Sure.
For me, there is another question here, and that relates to this kind of in the most ultimate way. If you are a young Egyptian and you're unemployed and your family lives on a dollar, maybe a two, and what should I tell you? Should I tell you that if you just patiently wait or vote and so on, I'm going to get you what? As our Secretary of Defense said, we're not going to turn into Switzerland. All right? But what are we going to turn into? Romania? Lebanon? That would be a dream ticket. So the lack of resources, the challenge of young generations in so many of these countries, especially those in oil, what it would take to get a flourishing economy is extremely challenging and doesn't look to me in the cards. What they're in effect answering is, I like to call it the fiddler of the roof answer. The guy's poor but happy. And I'm not recommending it. I'm going to be very clear. I'm not recommending it. But you can find dignity in praying 5 times a day, in growing a beard, in attending to your family. I'm not saying you should eat religion instead of dinner. I'm just saying we shouldn't be too quick to attack other sources of dignity than a car and a refrigerator and a washing machine. And so ultimately it'll come down to a definition of what is a good life. And that conversation hasn't even started.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Better Peter. I'm a political economy blogger. I just had a question for Mr. Etzioni. Or sorry, Dr. Etzioni.
Please.
I was just wondering
Times are for birds.
if we're talking about pluralism to some extent, I feel like there's a huge assumption behind it that one needs to be secular in order to have a truly objective discussion about pluralism. I personally disagree with it because I feel that a lot of people still bring their personal opinions to the table, even as a secular individual. Just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And so what we're going to have is a variety of combinations. If you go back to public opinion polls I mentioned, all those, I'm sorry, I forgot all. There's nothing public opinion poll. It stops the phrase all. The overwhelming majority of Muslims who do support democracy, which is a minority, said they want more religion in their life. So again, to the American ear, that sounds very much, how can that be? But that's what they want. And if you say democratic, is it their right to express their preferences? Their preferences is what Israel has, and what Turkey in effect has. If you've been to Turkey, you see, they pride themselves on having secularized, right? The first thing you hear in the major cities, call for prayer 5 times a day. You can't escape. They can sleep. And so, why is that secular? The crescent is on every building and on the Turkish flag. So, they may have, and of course, it's the most secular society among them all. So they may have secular veneers, but underneath it, there are different degrees of religion. And so the question is not, can we turn them into a liberal secular society? I don't think it's in the cards, and we don't have it in the West other than France and the United States. The question is, what kind of combination of religious, how degrees of freedom? And that gets, to be honest about it, one step to the question of the status of women, because it's affected by religious content. So it's extremely difficult for us to come to terms with the fact that people have different kinds but that's what pluralism means. And they're going to try a different concept. I'm going to add one more sentence about this notion of spring. I think we need to make a distinction between people who are good at wrecking regimes and people who are good at building regimes. And they're not necessarily the same. Historically, they were not the same. And so I have enormous respect, endless respect, for the people who have the courage to put the bodies on the line to bring down a Mubarak. I mean, what more can you ask, especially for those who did peacefully? Because I believe peace is the, non-violence is the first deepest moral commitment. But let's not assume that screaming in the squares will get you in the regime. So they did wonders in bringing down. But when you bring down a regime, you don't create a new one, you get anarchy. And invite new dictatorship. So the question is, we're going to come to forces who are not necessarily the same who wreck the old regime, who go on to lay the foundation for the new regime, which requires much more than elections. It requires self-constraint, it requires a vibrant economy, it requires a middle class, it requires education. So it's an enormous challenge we all face, and certainly the Middle East.
Other questions? I'd like to ask if the presenters have any closing thoughts then on the panel.
I just have a question. Who got the construction jobs for all those shopping malls?
Depends on what country you're looking at. Sometimes it was, I mean, in the case of, Jordan, and it was often Egyptian labor. In the case of Egypt, it was domestic labor.
Okay.
Tunisia, some domestic, some African. So it depends on where.
So it had to generate some income for the population.
I mean, in some countries like Jordan, there was no net benefit. Part of it too is you have to remember that these large towers also require a lot of public infrastructure to maintain. So for example, if you look at Jordan right now, on 6th Circle, there's these two huge towers called the Jordan Gate Towers. They're not finished, and part of the reason why they're not finished, their eyesores literally just standing there incomplete, is that when the municipality did a study, that if they were to flush the toilet all at the same time, it would drown Amman. That there would be a whole sewage, bubbling over. So, unfortunately, they were poorly studied. There wasn't very good urban planning, and often there was just such a race to what they thought was models of success that there are plenty of buildings that are substandard. And again, there are two towers in the skyline of Amman that have been stopped for a good about 8 years. And some of them are lack of capital, because once the financial crisis hit in 2008, a lot of the Gulf investors pulled out. So
Sure.
there are some towers that are incomplete. It's throughout the entire region.
Well, thank you all for your presentations, and thank you for your questions. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Congratulations.
Nice to meet you.